The ship came down from space. It came from the stars and the black velocities and the shining movements and the silent gulfs of space. It was a new ship. It had fire in its body and men in its metal cells, and it moved with a clean silence, fiery and warm. In it were 17 men, including a captain. The crowd at the Ohio field had shouted and waved their hands up into the sunlight, and the rocket had bloomed out great flowers of heat and color and run away into space on the third voyage to Mars. Mars is Heaven by Ray Bradbury, 1948. Hey, bookish friends. It is I, Damien, aka Sleepy Book Reader, and this is week 2 of Rocket Summer, the event that was supposed to take place during July, but I'm behind the ball. So I'm on week 2 and everyone else is probably on week 4. The event started by Michael K. Vaughan, where during a 4-week period, during the first week, we read science fiction from before 1939. Second week, which is this week, science fiction of 1940. The third week, 1950s, and the fourth week, 1960s. Um, and this ordering makes a pretty good kind of sense. The golden age of science fiction is mostly the 1940s. Officially, it started in 1938 and ended in 1950. And it was centered almost exclusively on Astounding magazine, edited by um, Robert W. Campbell. No, what's his first name? John W. Campbell. And I read an old John W. Campbell novel last time from 1931. Um, but by 1938, he took over the editing of Astounding magazine, Astounding Stories, it was called, and he changed the name to Astounding Science Fiction. And it was already the leading pulp in um, in the teeny tiny science fiction pulp scene that was going on in America. And then he blasted it off. He evolved science fiction very rapidly during that 12 year period. So I have read a few stories from astounding science fiction from the 40s, mostly some Theodore Sturgeon, but everything but one story I read actually did appear in Astounding. But out of my own copy of Astounding, I read some Theodore Sturgeon. I read part of The War Against the Rull, which I'll explain in a moment. And these are a fix-up novel of stories that appeared in Astounding Science Fiction. And then I picked up on Kindle the Science Fiction Hall of Fame. I wonder if I actually own this and have stored it away somewhere. But anyway, the Science Fiction Hall of Fame, Volume 1, it's short stories from 1929 to 1964, voted on by the Science Fiction Writers of America. And I picked out ones that were from the 1940s, which there were a good bunch of them there. So it was a good way to sample some of the most famous science fiction stories from the 1940s. One of them, by Ray Bradbury, and I read that one, was not from Astounding. It was from Planet Stories, which is generally considered a junk magazine, although I love that title. But for some reason, Ray Bradbury could never get published in Astounding. Um, and a few weeks ago, just by chance actually, I read this book all about Astounding magazine, which focused on the lives of John W. Campbell, Isaac Asimov, Robert Heinlein, and kind of shockingly, L. Ron Hubbard, who was an important figure at the time, but is now his work is pretty discounted in terms of the important science fiction of the time. But this was a fascinating book. I'll probably talk about it in greater depth maybe once I've finished the Rocket Summer, because there's a lot to say about it. But one thing I noticed from my reading here, and little hints in Robert, I keep calling him Robert, John W. Campbell's early work, but I know a lot of talk about here. Not People think Astounding and then Analog was engineering science fiction, and maybe it became that later, but it was first and foremost thought experiments. He really pushed the thought experiments. But secondly, he was really interested in how to engineer the human mind, how to advance uh, human potential mentally. And that appears in story after story. Not every story, but a lot of stories. And supposedly he gave out a lot of ideas to writers just to see what they would do. And Isaac Asimov is perhaps most humble about it. And he admits that the three laws of robotics come from John W. Campbell. Also, the idea of psychohistory that's in the foundation. He wanted to write a future empire, a future rise and fall of the Roman Empire thing, and John Campbell suggested the psychohistory. So he was very interested in ways that we can make the brain work better or get past humanity's problems so that, especially after the nuclear bomb, so that we can all be sane and make good decisions when we have the ability to destroy ourselves. So anyway, I started out and I thought I was going to read the whole War Against the Rull. And on one hand, it's kind of exciting storytelling, and on the other hand, it's so dense with activity that I was going through it rather slowly, and that kind of led me to research it. It's a bunch of stories written in the 50s turned into, I'm sorry, written in the 40s, turned into a novel in the 50s, I think around 1958, was it? Um, and it turns out that only two of the stories in here were originally about the aliens, the Rull, and the rest were other stories, and he rewrote them to fit into the Rull idea and make a sort of rough novel out of it so that he would have another novel to sell. And so I decided, well, that doesn't make this pure 1940s. Um, the main story that I did read in here, although it's just set as a series of chapters, was about surviving on a planet of super predators, and trying to get a super predator from, or a super like a, yeah. A. von Vogt had an interesting idea of intelligence. So there are creatures that are intelligent, and in this case telepathic, which I think telepathy also interested John W. Campbell, but have no civilization based on technology at all. So this creature, what was it called? It's a hard to pronounce word. An Iswal. The Iswals are intelligent and telepathic, but they hate humans and they have no uh, physical civilization. Anyway, the human and the Iswal have to survive together on this planet, and it's very intense. Um, but it was also kind of dense. It was a very dense read. And I could think of a bunch of science. So this was, I think this story was from 1940, or maybe, the one with the survival, or maybe 1942. But I can think of a ton of 90s and 2000s books that had elements that reminded me of this book. So one of the things, the small little sort of intense group of science fiction writers created the foundations upon which all other, whether what they wrote was well done or not. And I guess I kind of thought the writing in this one was good, but I've read other Van Voigt where I thought the writing was bad. But whether the writing was good or not, the ideas were there that everyone else works with afterwards. Um, and so another sort of example of examining the mind and human potential was this story in here um, by Theodore Sturgeon, who I know was also kind of had a close relationship with John W. Campbell from the book I read. I'm not, in maybe the late 40s or the early 50s also. Where is that story? It was called The Love of Heaven. And a man and his dog meet a sort of super evolved human who is from another branch of humanity that tens of thousands of years ago left Earth and went to another planet and evolved on another planet where everything there was poisonous to humans. So the few who survived and evolved, not only do they have telepathy and all kinds of powers, they are inimical to life on Earth. So this guy is just visiting Earth to sort of check it out and make sure that they can't live there, I guess, or maybe it's kind of a nostalgia history trip. And he also points out, we could come back to Earth, destroy all life here, and make life the way we want it, but we're not going to do that. So just kind of another playing with human evolution. And then a very striking story is one by, let me look, make sure I get the title right. It's Mimsy Where the Bora Grows. Where's the table of contents? So, Mimsy Where the Bora Grows by Lewis Paget, who is not really Lewis Paget. He is Catherine L. Moore and Henry Henry Kuttner writing together. They were a married couple, and I guess it was very hard to tell who wrote what. They wrote under a whole bunch of pseudonyms together, and both were very talented. And so most of their stories were co-written. And in any case, the Mimsy Where the Bora Grows, which is a reference to the Jabberwocky poem from Alice Through the Looking Glass, by Lewis Carroll. Is that right? Yeah, Lewis Carroll. Uh, Mimsy Where the Bora Grows is about a sort of post-human who invents a time travel machine, and he sends some of his children's toys back in time, um, in two different time travel machines. Both of them, I guess, get busted in the time that the circuitry fuses or whatever. So he thinks the experiment's a failure. But one set of toys arrives and is played with by Alice Hargreaves. I think that's her name, the inspiration for Lewis Carroll of Alice. And the other um, arrives in 1942, and some typical kids pick it up. And so they start playing with the toys and they become more and more advanced. A psychology professor just kind of shows up and starts semi figuring out what's going on. Not that it's uh, from time travel, but from their toys for some advanced thing that are teaching the children to think in X math that the regular humans don't think in. We think in Euclidean math. And the toys are sort of not magically, but training young minds that are still flexible. The youngest child is the most flexible and can be most able to think in this new way. And the key to everything for them is in the poem by the Jabberwocky, Mimsy Where the Bora Grows. And that allows them to understand fully this higher dimensional math. And spoilers, they disappear before their parents' eyes. So playing with that kind of idea of human potential and that sort of thing. But it's very, the way it was written was very much of its time, but it was fun to read. And it's still, and I've read it before years and years ago, so I wasn't surprised. But and then in Microcosmic God by Theodore Sturgeon, again, we have someone who invents tiny creatures who evolve really fast, and he plays God. He punishes them when they don't do what he wants. He rewards them when they do, and has them invent. They evolve rapidly, and then he assigns them things to do, and they evolve sciences over generations that can answer his questions before he sort of starts smiting down a third of every family and things like that. So he's a very nasty god. The Astounding book suggests this story was a metaphor for what John W. Campbell was doing with all his writers, giving them all ideas and seeing what they come up with. But that idea of super evolution and super advancement was so appealing to John W. Campbell and to his audience, I guess. There are many things, said Webster, that you thought of and we didn't. Things we wonder now how we ever missed. Abilities that you developed and we did not have. Take your own specialty, philosophy, but different than ours, a science, while ours never was more than ordered fumbling. Yours an orderly, logical development of philosophy, workable, practical, applicable, an actual tool. Um, then I read The Huddling Place, which by Clifford D. Simic, and The Huddling Place eventually became part of the fix-up novel City, and it's about humans who are kind of failing. And it has a very clever twist ending at the end, I thought, although it also contains the ideas like there's these Martian philosophers who have turned philosophy into a real science, and they're about to make major breakthroughs that's going to affect everyone's life. And that also fits into that sort of idea of advancing the mental sciences, so to speak, the mental states. But this is happens to be Martians, and actually humans are in decline, and are they reach a certain age and they become agoraphobic, and they can't really leave their homes anymore, no matter how important things are. And I think it might be one of the first in the city sequence. So we don't have talking dogs yet, but we do have robots, and the robot plays a small but a major role. You wouldn't know from this story how important the robots were to become. Um, but so Simak is interesting because he's playing in areas that would interest John W. Campbell, but at least from the way it's described in here, it would be kind of counter to the kind of thing Campbell wanted, really, where humans rise up, not they fall down. Um, and then it was also an Astounding Minute. It doesn't play well. You know what? It does. Only a Mother by Judith Merrill is about it's I think this was written like maybe 1948, and it's about a world in which a lot of people are exposed to radioactivity. A lot of children are infanticide, although illegal, has become common if your children are too mutated. um, but it goes deep into the mind of this mother who's having a baby. She doesn't see anything wrong with it, and in fact, it's super intelligent, super advanced. By the time it's like 7 months old, it's mentally the equivalent of a 4-year-old, can speak with its mother, and everything like that. And it has this ending that didn't shock me at all, but maybe it was a shock ending at the time. But its intensity, its psychological intensity from the mother's point of view was interesting. And this was by Judith Merrill, and I mentioned C.L. Moore. There was Lee Brackett, and there was some other writers. There were women writers. It was mostly male, but there were women writers back then. But it was definitely, they were almost always writing from the point of view of a man's world, where they thought men would always be doing the real jobs and women would be staying at home. In fact, Mimsy was the Borogroves was funny because the husband comes home from work and he and his wife sip cocktails and smoke cigarettes and kind of half pay attention to their kids. It seemed like a very, I don't think that C.L. Moore and Henry Kuttner had children at the time, actually. But anyway. And then there's Mars is Heaven, which is an utterly brilliant story by Ray Bradbury. And it's shocking that that someone like John W. Campbell wouldn't publish it. But I guess he just didn't like Bradbury's poetic vision and perhaps his bittersweet view of humanity and his nostalgia. He was always looking back in a way to a better day, the sense that, things were better in the 1920s than the 1940s, perhaps. I didn't even know Bradbury wrote such important stuff in the 40s because it's so different from what everyone wrote. It was so poetic, really a clever twist, but maybe not what you want from your rocket summer. Not even though I think the term rocket summer comes from Ray Bradbury, but it's not high adventure. It sort of undercuts it all, maybe. Really, of all the things I read, the only high adventure was the war against the Rull. And I know because I've read a lot of A. von Vogt when I was a teenager and maybe a little bit into my 20s. He did a lot of outer space adventure, especially the Voyage of the Space Beagle, which kind of established many of the cliches that we see in Star Trek and in Aliens and in all kinds of other movies or TV shows. Is that it for me? I think that covers just about everything I read. I didn't go and reread Heinlein or Asimov. It just sort of happened that way that I guess the most famous writer I read here was Ray Bradbury and then Theodore Sturgeon. It was fun to dig into this stuff. I really want to spend even more time. I there was a time in my early 20s when I read a ton of golden age science fiction, and everything in the golden age, that period from 38 to 40, 38 to 50, was in magazines. There was almost no book publications. In I think maybe Isaac Asimov got a book publication towards the very end of the 40s, and maybe that's when Heinlein started to. But almost everything happened in the magazines, and a ton of the paperbacks published in the late 50s, early 60s were reprints from those 1940s stuff. So as I look at 50s stuff, I have to be sure it's not really 40s stuff. Um, and starting in 1950, which I guess we'll get to next week, I hope, I am going on vacation for a whole week with my daughter, so I don't know how much reading I'm getting done. So it might be a week and a half before I cover the 1950s. We'll see. But going into the 1950s, according to what I read here, and it matches what I've read elsewhere, there were two other major magazines that started up maybe 1949, 1950: the magazine of fantasy and science fiction, and the and Galaxy magazine. So they were in competition with John W. Campbell and Astounding at the same time that John W. Campbell was getting a little narrower in his obsessions. And so yeah, so science fiction would change again, but it was I think it was on the basis of that the field stands on the foundation of things like H.G. Wells, and then on the crazy space opera of the late 20s, early 30s, and then on the growing sophistication of the stories in terms of their ideas and their thought that goes beyond the whole thought experiment idea um, gets established. And then we have an incredible base upon which to build science fiction with more and more writers, more and more magazines, paperback book publishers, eventually hardback book publishers. By the 70s, the bestseller list for some of these top writers. So it's very exciting to me. Since you're not answering, continued Jameson softly, I must guess that you think you're going to get through by yourself. All your long life, all the long generations of your ancestors, you and your kind have depended entirely on your magnificent bodies for survival. While men herded fearfully in their caves, discovering fire as a partial protection, desperately creating weapons that have never before existed, always a bare jump ahead of violent death. All those hundreds of centuries, the Iswal of Carson's planet roamed his great fertile continents, unafraid, matchless in strength as in intellect, needing no homes, no fires, no clothing, no weapons, no adaptation to a difficult environment, the Iswal interrupted coolly, is a logical goal of the superior being. Human beings have created what they call civilization, which is in fact merely a material barrier between themselves and their environment. This barrier is so complex and unwieldy that merely keeping it going occupies the entire existence of the race. Individually, man is frivolous, unsuspecting, a slave who spends his life in utter subservience to artificiality and dies wretchedly of some flaw in his disease-ridden body. And it is this arrogant weakling, with his insatiable will to dominance, that is the greatest existing danger to the sane, self-reliant races of the universe.